on is what's called attachment theory. So these are the attachments, and I will get into it in a moment, developed by Bowlby and Ainsworth and Mary Main, the connections, the important connections that go on between mother and baby. Now, attachment theory is a deep and enduring emotional bond. It's not something that just sort of happens like bonding. It's something that endures over time and space, and it's to a very important person in your life, okay? It starts with the parents, obviously, because they're the ones that are there. And the nature of the attachment is going to impact strongly in stressful situations. And that's what Bowlby and Ainsworth said. And it's really interesting because the way they tested this was, they didn't have a pandemic, but what they had was, they had what's called a strange situation, and it involved separation. And this is really interesting, I've always thought, because in order to come up with classifications for attachment between baby and parent, they separated them. So there is a connection between separation and attachment. It's like two sides of the coin, okay? I think that is a really important thing to say, because a lot of the theories, for example, you may have heard of, separation theories, separation individuation theories, Margaret Mahler, for example. That was more of a theory that looked at how a child separates and the different stages that they separate. But they didn't really talk about attachment. And attachment talked about attachment, but really didn't talk about separation. But it's interesting, I think, that they used separation to come up with the attachment. So as far as I'm concerned, there is a strong connection between attachment and separation. And you really know the type of attachment that a child has to a parent, and later with their husbands and wives and other important people in their lives, by when there's a separation, okay? So briefly, I'm just going to look at the attachment styles, just briefly, okay? Just so we'll move to the next slide. Okay, I wasn't even going to put secure attachment because I thought it's obvious, but I guess we should. So there's secure attachment and insecure attachment, basically. Now, secure attachment, children feel protected, they can depend on their parents, okay? The clue is, how does this happen? Well, parents are very responsive. So parents respond to the needs and soothe when the child is distressed. Now, we are mediators and we are therapists, and we know about all this. So I'm sure that, you think, oh, I know all that. But you wouldn't believe some people aren't really familiar with some of these concepts. So I think it's important as mediators, as therapists, to go over it so we can help people, or the people that we see, our clients, with some of this, or certainly recognize and send them to somebody who could. Okay, so very important that we are aware that responsivity is really a significant thing in order to soothe the child. And finally, parents are sensitively attuned and regard their children's feelings as valid. This sounds obvious as well, but it isn't, because how can you be sensitively attuned? If you were raised with a parent who wasn't so sensitively attuned, sometimes it slips out and you mean well, but old patterns come back. Now, I didn't tell you this beautiful term, internal working model, IWM, which Bowlby also came up with, and that basically is the prototypes or the mini maps that we've internalized from the times when we were babies. So when we're a parent, we pull out that old map and we sometimes use it subconsciously. And that's when we make a mistake and we maybe are not so sensitively attuned. One of my students in university several years ago said, but isn't that rude to our parents if we don't use their map? And I said, well, they were limited to the times and what they had available to them, and we respect our parents. Believe me, I've always respected mine, and I always tell others that it's really important to be respectful. However, sometimes we want to use the good stuff and we want to upgrade, and change some of the things that we weren't so crazy about that didn't work so well. So that's where we have to really fine tune how to be sensitively attuned. We also want to regard our children's feelings as valid, The wrong thing to say is don't be stupid, don't be silly, it's nothing, it's going to be over in 5 minutes, especially when it's not, when we're talking about the pandemic. Sometimes parents, not us, will say things like that, you know, they will minimize it because they say, I just didn't want my kid to worry. So I said, that's nothing, you know. In the meantime, the child is crying. Well, it is something if the child is worried, right? So we have to regard what the children say is valid. So that just sort of quick in a nutshell. I'm trying to go quick here because I have so much I want to tell you today. To insecure attachment. And this one, oh my God, okay, we'll try and go through this very quickly. Insecure, they've got quite a few sections to it. So I just picked out 3 in each section and to move it along. The insecure avoidant attachment is when parents, so if you end up with a child who's insecure avoidant, they just weren't born that way. Although we need to consider nature and nurture. Nature meaning the genetic component, nurture meaning the environmental component. It's not an either or these days, it's an interactive thing. We have to take into account the temperament of the child, how the child genetically is, you know, functions, and what is the light switch. That's, you know, what switches on the light. That's the environment, which is the genetic light, if you will. So for insecure avoidant attachment to happen, parents are doing something. So the parents are largely emotionally unavailable or they're unresponsive. Okay, that's what the child, or that's the perception of what the child sees. And the child has to develop a false independence, or as Winnicott said in the later years, a false self, false independence. So he's got to do his own thing or her own thing, can't count on anybody. And finally, when that child is faced with separation or stress, that child does not seek contact with that parent. There's just no point. I have to handle it myself. Okay, so you're going to see some people like that. So when people are in stress, they're not all the same in stress. It really depends where they're coming from, what kind of attachment they had, you know, how they came to this place is my point. Next one is insecure ambivalent attachment. So these are the parents that are inconsistent. Sometimes they'll be really happy when a child, you know, splashes them with water, for example, in the garden with the hose, and other times they'll be yelling their head off. They're inconsistent. They can't predict how this parent is going to react. It depends on their mood or what's going on, but they can't predict it. So they're inconsistent. They may be nurturing at times, but insensitive and emotionally unavailable at other times. And how does the child act in situations like this when they're raised this way? The child can act clingy to have their needs met, or they can be rejecting. They can reject this, so they could be, I need you, and I don't want anything to do with you. And because they're ambivalent, they don't know what to make of this parent. So it's not like suddenly a child's going to get clingy. There's a reason behind clingy behavior. Okay, and we'll move on to the next slide. I'm mindful of the time here. Okay, disorganized, disoriented, insecure attachment. Those are the ones that where the parents have left the child alone with no support at all, or very little support in times of distress. And there may be abuse, and they talk about physical abuse to intimidate them. So the cases that you see in mediation are probably the ones that also go with this designation. Also, there may have been traumatic events that have happened to the parent that they are working through the child. And how does the child react? Well, they disconnect, they're scared, and they may freeze or not know how to act and be very disorganized and like a robot in many ways, so they can act in that fashion in these situations when they have this kind of parenting and then this kind of attachment results. So that is the attachment piece, and I'll move on to my next section, which is this. This is my baby, intensive parent. It's really intensive mothering, but I'm adding parenting for the fathers who are also very involved. In other words, if you have a parent who is really involved, you will likely end up an intensive parent. And what is an intensive parent? I mean, if you don't know, you can get my book, Intensive Mothering, The Cultural Contradictions of Modern Motherhood. and it applies to fathers. Intensive mothering in a nutshell, or parenting, is centers on the children's needs, methods informed by experts, labor intensive, and children are entitled to this investment. Those are the 4 criteria. And it's very, very funny because when I did the book, I edited a whole collection on it. I thought, I wasn't one of them. And then I decided to do characteristics in the book, which I'm not going to bore you with. I did it for a while. And then I looked at all the characteristics and I went, oh my God, I was one of them too. Okay? And we don't even know we are, because it's a societal thing. We are expected to be intensive parents in our society. And it's also, I don't want to say competitive, but it is. We want to be good at our job, especially if we've taken a back seat. And I've written about, you know, the mummy track as well. If we've taken a back seat to our career a little bit when our children were young, we want to do a really good job of this. So again, it becomes intensive parenting. Grandparenting, I'm writing about now, intensive grandparenting. It's an extension of this, and it looks pretty well the same because grandparents now, especially grandmothers, do a lot more with the children than they ever did. Okay, so there's an intensive amount of involvement. Now, what does this have to do with what we're talking about? Well, intensive parenting in a pandemic, okay, if we're used to intensive parenting, what do you think is going to happen when we sit down to help this child do homework? And I've heard this. He didn't do enough homework. Everybody else is much, you know, is ahead in the reading now. He didn't do all the work. I've been chasing after him. Okay, she didn't do this. It's like the intensive parenting has followed us into the online teaching now. And especially in the younger grades where there's 40 minutes of lessons and the rest involves the parents teaching, there's a lot of intensive parenting going on. There's also, and I never thought of this, but I was listening to one of the multitude of webinars and someone said this and I thought, whoa, this is smart. I'd never even thought about this. Intensive parenting is also the opposite, the flip side, which is that if you're intensively involved and you haven't prepared your child for bad times or stressful times because you fixed everything, what do you think this is going to do to now? The child doesn't know what's happening, you know, is so scared because they've had everything taken care of. I never even thought of this when I did the intensive parenting, but that's a valid point too. So we've got both over involvement, and also we've done so much to the point that the child is afraid or can't. I saw children in my practice like that, especially ones that went off to university who were crying in my office. I can't go to university without my mother. I don't know how to shop and do the laundry, you know. So yeah, so this intensive parenting, although, and we're not talking about it much now, but if we're ever interested, we can address it at a future point. But it serves a function. I'm not discounting it. It serves a function, and you know, many a function. But on the other hand, it also makes it quite difficult for children to face adversity when we've had intensive parenting. Okay, what another option to that is what Donald Winnicott suggested, which is good enough parenting. You probably are mothering, and then now we're expanded it to parenting, which is you don't have to be perfect. You don't have to be amazing. You just have to be good enough. And, you know, this was pretty comforting. Just do the best you can. And, you know, and that really is very helpful. Everybody loved Winnicott. He came up with so many different theories that everybody uses to these days. Now, finally, for this parenting section here, I want you to be aware that there are different parenting styles, and you guys know that, I'm sure. There's the authoritarian, there's the permissive, there's the neglectful. I put in bold authoritative because that's the one you should aim for. That's the one to go for. Okay, we don't want to be neglecting our kids or let them do everything they want or be super authoritarian. We want to be what they call authoritative. Okay, so we'll move to the next slide. And this was, it's as old as time, this stuff, and I'm sure you've seen it. She didn't relate it to the attachment theory secure stuff, but I say, I guess this would fall more into secure parenting. And basically the authoritative parent is you're highly responsive. They say that there's high demand, so they're not really saying do what you want. I would put more realistic demands, not high, to tell you the truth. I would change it, but that's what she said. Setting limits on behaviors and being consistent in enforcing boundaries. I think that the important thing to take away from this is responsiveness and consistency, being consistent, and boundaries. Boundaries are really important for children, okay? You have to have a sense of what's okay, what's not okay, a sense of boundaries, what we should do in this time frame. That brings security, okay? Some examples of authoritative parenting are the parent is warm, they're attuned, they're on the same page, they're nurturing, they listen to what their kids are saying. I don't mean listen to whatever the kid says you do. I mean that they're listening to what the child is communicating, and they allow autonomy, they allow independence, they encourage independence. They're not saying don't go anywhere because the world is a scary place. They're encouraging independence, except for now, which is the opposite. We are trying to protect our children. So some of these have been thrown on its side, but okay, we'll move it along. And authoritative parenting, some examples of what you can do is reasoning with children. Children like to have a reason why something is going to happen. The ones that, like the old school ways, the way I was raised, it was probably because I said so. That doesn't work anymore. Kids want a reason. If you give them a reason, some parents say, well, it takes too long to go into the reason. Let me just tell him, unless he's running in the street or she's running in the street and you have to be just quick. And, you don't need to give a reason as the cars are pulling, driving towards your child. But you need to give a child a reason they expect it, and they need to understand why you expect something. And if you explain it, they're usually pretty reasonable. Setting clear limits on behavior. You can do this at this time, but at that time not. You need to sort of give the boundaries, the rules of the game. They're really good with limits on behavior if you consistently enforce them. So you have to be consistent. Monday, you can't do one set of rules and Tuesday another. You can't bring your kid late to school and then on Monday and then yell at them for not being ready on Tuesday, okay? Because you weren't ready on Tuesday. So you have to be pretty consistent. We hear the term positive discipline. It sounds like one cancels the other out, but these are examples, I guess, of disciplining in a positive way. So I don't even know if I like the word discipline, but yeah, parenting, I would say positive parenting. Earning children's respect. They're not going to just respect you because you're the parent. You need to be a certain way for them to look up to you and to what you have to say. Okay, so that's what authoritative parenting is. Moving it along, and I thought, what can we draw from other theorists and thought processes that sort of link up with this period of time? And I thought of grief, loss, and meaning. Okay, I already told you that separation and attachment are connected. Well, in this pandemic, separation is key. I mean, when we think of the crises of life, we think of death. I mean, that's the ultimate separation. We think of divorce, that's a separation. Even the defenses, that I teach my students about, that we see in death and dying is present in divorce situations, as you know. And the defenses, the stages, they look the same. So when we look at this, the ones that would apply to this stressful situation, this pandemic situation, there are 7 stages. I found 7, not the 5 original ones, the 7 that they have been writing about in the divorce situation. And yeah, and those ones are denial, pain and fear, anger, bargaining, guilt, depression, and acceptance in the divorce situation. I think these 7 stages really apply. The ones that I think really apply the most in this particular situation with the pandemic is the fear and the guilt. And what am I talking about when I say the fear? And the fear is obvious. I mean, is the world coming to an end? Question, when are we going to get out of here? How's it going to look? We even worry about it. Why wouldn't the kids worry about it? Of course they're worried about it. And the guilt factor. The guilt really happens, I notice, in the co-parenting situation. For example, when you leave one parent to go to the other, and if especially, and I've seen cases like, well, not seen them online, I've seen them or heard or talked to them on the phone. They talk about how I had to leave my mother to go to my father because that's the parenting plan. And the guilt, will she be okay? Will he be okay when I leave him? Okay, so there's a lot of guilt that we are seeing as well in this pandemic that is really, nobody's really talking too much about, but you'll probably see it. The defenses that are used, there's tons of defenses, I'm not going to go through them, but the ones that I pulled out are projection and displacement. And I've seen those a lot. Now, I'm going to give you an example of projection, for example. Projection is basically when I have thoughts and feelings that are upsetting me, but I don't feel comfortable owning them. So I'm going to attribute them to someone else. For example, if a parent feels abandoned by their child because that child was self-isolating with the other parent, what may end up happening is when that child ultimately has to leave that abandoned parent, that child is going to act as if he is the one being abandoned. Remember I said earlier that in other words, he is reflecting what the parent is feeling. Okay, so that is a projection. Basically, the parent is projecting onto the child how they feel abandoned, so the child feels ultimately as if he's doing the abandoning, or then feels whatever it is that the parent is feeling. So that's an example of projection. Another one is, in other words, putting something that you don't feel comfortable on and it's attributed to somebody else, okay? Then there's the displacement one, and the displacement one is if I'm angry at my dad because he's bossing me around to do my homework all the time, I'll yell at my grandfather on the phone. Because I can't tell my dad, stop making me do so much homework, because then he'll start saying, you really need to do it. So grandpa calls, how are you? And the next thing I know, grandpa's being yelled at. And it's really because the child is upset at somebody else, okay? So displacement is when you take how you feel, instead of directing it to the right person, you're putting it on somebody else. That's why there's so much sibling rivalry too, because they're taking it on each other instead of addressing where it should go. So how do we deal with this is the question. And I think that that is something that we need to think about. I think we need to talk to children more. For example, the first example, I know you're worried about me. This is for the projection, okay? When you're suddenly getting really upset about abandoning your parent, whereas they're the one that really feels abandoned, you would say something like, I know you're worried about me, but I'll be okay. So you're reflecting the feeling back to them, and you're number one, and then you're reassuring them that you'll be okay, okay? The last thing I was going to say about this is something very interesting I've noticed, fear of loss. There are some people who are always worried that something bad will happen and they'll lose somebody. Somehow they do better because it's happened. They're not afraid anymore. So, but fear of loss is a big thing, because if you spend a lot of time being afraid that you're going to lose someone or something, that can be quite debilitating as well. So I'll move it along because it is getting late. Now, I love this quote. The best way out is always through. Okay, we got to work it out. We can't run away. It's going to run after us. Okay, so building resilience is really important. You've heard a lot of talks about resilience, and resilience is basically, as you know, the rising above it, coping with it, coping strategies, coping skills. It's a nature-nurture thing. Again, it's environmental genetic. The way to get through it is through flexibility, adaptability, and buoyancy, okay? If you can adapt quite easily, okay, if you can, buoyancy is to rise above it, to be flexible enough, like if you're the type of person who says, and your children are listening, well, or you're encouraging your children to stay on this path. If a child is very much, or the parent is very much in the past situation, we never had this before and we used to blah, blah, blah. And we've got, you know what, we have to be flexible. We're not in what was right now. We're here now. We're in the moment now. And that's what we have to deal with. That's an example of resilience of one of the strategies. Moving it along, strategies, the temporary nature, we need to say, now we're moving into the strategies part, the temporary nature of the problem. This too shall pass, okay? Like the George Harrison song. Yeah, this, I know not today, tomorrow, but it will. This is a temporary situation, hopefully. Okay, and that's what we have to communicate to the children. I say that to my grandson. When am I going to see you again? I'll say, we're going to see each other pretty soon. In a few weeks, not tomorrow, but soon. Okay. Okay. Dealing with the now, as I said, I just mentioned that before, is really important. Going from moment to moment, reaching out to helpful. Everyone says reach out to support networks. They're not so helpful, some of them. If someone's gonna make you feel worse, don't call them. If someone's gonna, is super anxious and you're anxious already, maybe that's not the person to do FaceTime with. Try to reach out to helpful support networks. And people who say, tell me how someone said this on a webinar I heard on happiness, tell me how you feel, not how are you, and they don't listen to whether you said fine, because we all just say fine automatically, okay? Seek solutions rather than ruminating. You're not gonna find solutions to this problem because it's too big. Even though I listen to every medical person, I still don't know what to do, okay? I'm not a doctor, and even if I was, I'm not a medical doctor. Even if I was, I wouldn't know what to do because somebody else is kind of calling the shots, right? It's beyond our control, okay? So I think what we have to do is seek solutions to the smaller things in our life, things that we can control. If we start ruminating about it, it's not gonna be very helpful, okay? Maybe a solution is just to listen to a webinar, just to know what's out there. Okay, gratitude turns what we have into enough. My meditation teacher came up with this one. Yeah, that's a good one. Gratitude turns what we have into enough. So you got to be grateful for what you have. Instead of saying I'm trapped in my house and this is like jail, you should say I'm safe in my house. Something small like that makes a big difference. And your gratitude, you think about all the things that you've got in your life that you're grateful for. I think that that's very helpful. Okay, manage your feelings either through meditation or through art. I do my watercolor class. I'm terrible, but at least, it keeps me focused on something else. Anything calming, keeping a journal. I tell my clients, you have to keep a journal. So you put it in the journal, you close the journal and you put it away. You're not walking around with it in your heart. It's really important. This one's really tough. Comfort with the unknown. Oh, you know what? It's really hard to be comfortable with what we don't know. But what we can't do is say, I know that I don't know, but what I do know is, so being comfortable with what you do know, okay? So you work with that. Looking within yourself for confirmation. A lot of this is about, as I said before, looking, other people are calling the shots. It's all outside of our control. We have to look inside of ourselves for some kind of confirmation. And I think the way we can do that also is, what happened? What did we do that was big in the past that worked? Look at something in the past that was successful, how I managed adversity in the past. And maybe I can bring it with me. For example, I was watching a program on Holocaust survivors, and they were saying all of the things that they did in the concentration camp and how they're applying that to this situation. So look at past successful strategies and bring them into your present situation. Now, it's not easy for everybody. Some people, this triggers past scary experiences and puts them back there. And that's a whole other story. I'm not minimizing anything. I'm just saying that if there was something you could say to a child, remember that time when you had a lot of trouble in soccer and you couldn't, kick the ball once, and then all of a sudden, you practiced, and, you want to give a child some power that they overcame something, and we will overcome this as well. And finding meaning in every moment. All of the webinars seem to focus on meaning. You got to have a reason to get up in the morning. There has to be something that you find meaning in. And I think that we have to hang on to that we do have meaning in our life, and this is what it is. So I think that that's another wonderful strategy for resilience. Okay, we'll move it along. Strategies now for, I'm moving now from resilience. I'm rushing because we have only 15 minutes. Okay, effective parenting. Where does the time go? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, effective parenting. Okay, safe boundaries already said, having and giving children control over small things. So they can't control the big things, but they can make a decision whether they want pizza today or a tuna sandwich, okay? So something, control over the smaller things in the day-to-day routine. Setting up a routine, everybody knows, especially our mediators, know about how important a routine is, a calendar is. The successful parents are the ones that have some kind of a routine during the day when they have the kids all day and they're working, where there's, both are working, the parents, and one will take over at this time, and the child has a routine of what they do, when's breakfast, when's lunch, when's art time, when's playtime, when's puzzle time, when's work time, so it's important to have some kind of a routine to structure the day. Otherwise, it just looks like a big blur. And again, it feels pretty daunting to face the day when you have nothing going on. Thinking something positive every day, okay? Yeah, we went through that already. Consistency, being consistent parents, being predictable, and being reliable, okay? So those are the three key words for effective parenting. Doing something constructive each day, finding meaning in the chaos, okay? So there has to be something meaningful. And some people are saying, what can I learn from this? Oh, look, there are animals in my backyard now, all of a sudden running wild. Isn't that nice? And the air is cleaner, and, just find meaning somehow in this chaos, all right? Modeling effective communication and behavior, because if you do it, the kids will follow it, okay? So you want to be a good role model for children. I'm rushing through it, you have to excuse me. Next, we'll go to, okay. Explain your expectations and the reasons behind them. I already said that. Very important to reason. I didn't get into the transitional object, but that's really important. That's Winnicott. Also, transitional object is the stuffy that your child goes to daddy with when he leaves you, and you can't forget it. It's really important because it's the connection between this environment and the other environment. It's the link, it's the bridge. So the transitional object is something that we need to think about. Transitional objects also are other things too, and I've talked a lot about that also. It could be not so much transitional object, but transitional phenomena. That's the extracurricular activities or the transitional, linking, I'm there and I'm not there, between fantasy and reality. Play is a transitional phenomena too. And play is really important, actually, for kids to have a playtime during the day, because that taps every area of development in a child, and it has an intrinsic value you're not getting. As a matter of fact, they did studies on that. They gave rewards to children who were playing and they lost interest in playing. So it's an intrinsic activity. So it's really important. I've already told you how to reflect. I gave you an example early on, reflect a feeling and explain. I know you are worried about me, but I'll be okay. Parentification is a big no-no. What that means is if you start turning the kid into your parent, I'm really scared, sleep with me in my bed. This is no good, okay? You don't want the child to be your parent, because that doesn't work out very well. Then who's the parent of the child, okay? So, okay, I already said, I'll move it along here. Being versus doing. We are always telling our children all the things they should accomplish in life. This is maybe the time for them just to be. And you know what? Children should be allowed, and adults should be allowed to just be sometimes anyways. outside of a pandemic. So being versus doing is also what Winnicott talked about, and it's a very important concept. Parents should anticipate and be realistic. Don't anticipate that a child is going to be different than what that child is, or under these circumstances, you can't expect them to be a model child. You have to anticipate what's going to happen and be realistic about it. I love the be firm but kind. Okay, giving choices are set. And next. Okay, I love these. Back up. These are from my vault of ideas with children. Back up and see the whole picture. Sometimes if you're too close, you don't see the whole picture. Sometimes children say something's bothering them and it's not that at all, it's something else. So you have to back up and look at the whole picture and try to see what the real issue is, because they'll say that this is bothering them and it could be something else. Remember, projection and displacement is defenses as well. Just remember, you don't make it about the person, it's about the issue. I love you, you're really smart, but whatever. You have to stay away from you're a good boy, you're a bad boy. You know, you can't really focus on the person, you have to focus on the issue. You're great, but you know, this is not acceptable, this behavior that you punched your sister's lights out, you know, yeah. Okay, don't bring back old dirt. Really important in marriages too. You don't want to bring back things that, yeah, now you're acting like this. Remember that time you did that too? That just makes it all worse. And the natural and logical consequence is very good. Some parent told me the other day that there was a punishment for not doing homework during the pandemic. And, if you're going to have some kind of consequence, it should be a logical consequence. The punishment has to match the crime. In other words, if you don't do your work, it's got to be related to the work. You're not going to say you can't ride your bike if you don't do your work. Your bike has nothing to do with your work. It's got something, you've got to make your consequence relate to what it is that the child is or isn't doing. So you have to really put some thought into the consequence, okay? So, and finally, okay, I developed a theory based on Michael Eigen's theory, which was on distinction union. And it's basically in a nutshell how that in life, the DNA of life really is an interaction between separation and connection. And I've applied it to everything that I've done. And I think it's so true. And Michael also felt, he introduced it in the psychoanalytic literature when he talked about borderline people. But I think it's the DNA of life. There's an interaction between separation and connection, the alone together theory, I call it. And examples of that are FaceTime, independent interactive activities. You need both in life. And that's why we're on FaceTime and Zoom so much, because we're missing the connectedness aspect. If we have too much of the independent part of it. Okay. And okay, then I had 3 examples. A child who won't go to bed at night as a stressful situation, shifting gear difficulties and defenses, and a child who wants to watch TV all day. Okay, so we don't need to go through how to handle situations like this. I think we only have like 5 minutes left, so I will I'll take questions then, because I think I gave examples of some of those anyway, so I think we're okay.
All right. Okay, and Simon will send me your questions. So if you just want to use the Q&A, then you can type those in. As I was listening to you, Linda, it's interesting to me to have my son here and hear some of the things that you talk about, and the consistency part. I think he could attest to. The consistency in our house was legendary, and I was right 50% of the time. So I think that it was across the board. It worked out okay. But I loved your quotes. I think I have a lot of presentations using quotes, and I want to steal some of them, and especially your mother's. I think with giving her credit for it, because it's sort of like, for me, it really just siphons down into a few words, like almost like a mission statement to yourself. Like, one of our quotes in our family is "drive happy," because one of the our car didn't work, and it was a very strange problem, and it was this recurring electrical problem, and finally the mechanic said, "Just drive happy." So
That's
now,
beautiful. I love
yeah, so
that.
now we
Yeah.
just use drive happy in terms of like when you don't know what else to do and you really can't fix it, like what you can just try to drive happy and see if your attitude affects the mechanics of the car,
Yeah.
which
But
it's
attitude
not.
is really important.
It
That's a
is.
real true
Yeah.
quote.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I really like that. And then I think the connection between separation and attachment, I think it's really neat to think of those as a two-sided coin. Like think about, the being separated
Mhm.
appropriately and being attached appropriately are sort of like, I really do see those and I hadn't thought of that before as a separate sort of event. Um,
I think it was always there in the theory, but nobody really paid too much attention to it. But it's just so true that separateness and connectedness operate in life right through the lifespan. There's a separateness and connectedness that's sort of intertwined. Sometimes more of one, sometimes more of the other.
yeah.
But yeah.
Yeah, I think that's really neat. And then I think it's Bowlby's theory, the secure base, so the safe haven. And I wondered, what do you do in situations where that secure base isn't there, and
Mhm.
there could be violence in the home, or the children are experiencing an intense level of conflict between their parents because
Yeah.
you know, I personally think, even in my own family, there's more opportunity for conflict because we're just together a lot more, and there's only
Mhm.
so much space for us to get our, independence and togetherness needs taken care of. But what do you say to those kids who are like,
Well, just in response to the like a regular situation that you're describing, or in this, well, not so regular that's become regular in the
yeah,
pandemic situation, having time apart and together is a boundary that needs to be set right now. And I've even heard that kids are even saying, "I need some time alone in my room."
mhm,
So they're
yeah,
establishing their separateness. And now we're going to have some alone time. Now we're going to have some separateness. I don't think anyone really talks too much about that. But in just regularly speaking about abusive situations is what you're talking about.
mhm,
As I said before, nobody's going to be very, very different all of a sudden. As a matter of fact, this is going to magnify, as you know, whatever difficulties are pre-existing. So that's why mediators and therapists are going to be quite busy helping these people out. The good part is it is not a genetic predisposition. I won't say predisposition, but a genetic thing. Or that, in other words, this is it and we can't do anything about it. In other words, my daddy did this, so I'm going to do this kind of thing.
mhm,
Comments like that don't really wash. So what's going to happen is, I know that this is what you saw, but we're going to try some different ways, because oftentimes when people behave in certain abusive ways, they don't want to. It's just they don't know any other way. So if they have new strategies that can work where they're not that way, they
mhm,
can repair the damage that in other words, if you start interacting with your children in a different way that you get better results, it's a reparative process also within you too. You fixed your own childhood as well.
mhm.
So I think introducing parents to new ways of being is very helpful. Something else, I used to do play therapy for many, many, many years. And the parents never came. They only came for the parent consultation. They weren't supposed to come. Dr. Otto wanted to train me in that. And that's the way it was done, according to the object relations theory. The parents weren't supposed to come. They were coming to the parent consultation. And once I said to him, I asked him, how did the parents change then? Okay. And he said, you just watch. Okay. What ends up happening all the time was the child changed, the parent adjusted to the child's changing, and they changed
Hmm, yeah,
without even the parental involvement. So, any kind of intervention of a positive nature where the child sees himself in a different way and doesn't perhaps act out in the way that they used to will have an impact on the way the parent sees him. And the parent suddenly would come in and say, I thought that my child was horrible and, he's nice, so it's really very
it,
weird. Yeah.
it's actually really good to hear you speak about the hopefulness of change, right? So that
Yeah.
we think about the patterns that maybe our parents and that that map that we all have apparently, um,
Mhm.
and that we can change that. And they, like, it sounds like even small behaviors can
Yeah.
start to have positive changes. So that's, I like that hope.
Absolutely.
There's a
You can't
question.
lose hope. Yeah. And and now that you mentioned hope, I didn't mention this because I raced through the end part. Hopefulness in this pandemic is really important. We
Yeah.
have to give children hope, not that we're going to be sitting here forevermore.
Yeah.
That's not helpful. Yeah.
I know, and I think we all could use an extra dose of hope. A participant
Hopefulness.
asked,
Yeah.
"What do you say to children when one parent speaks very negatively about the
Oh,
other parent?" Oh, such a good question.
yeah, that's an excellent question.
Yeah.
Okay. And we heard a lot about that in the co-parenting talk. Remember, yeah, uh, as we know, that's unacceptable. And I'm not going to use the term alienation, parental alienation. It depends how bad it gets. However, it is an emotional. It is an emotional parental alienation, actually, isn't it, Marianne?
Yeah.
But I think what needs to happen is if the other parent becomes aware, and I think that they do become aware, even if the child doesn't say, Daddy said this about you or Mommy said this about you, they can suddenly see how the child is interacting with them when they come back from the visitation, from the
Yeah.
crossover, I call it, or the visitation crossover. And I think the parent has to be brave and say, you know what, it seems as if, you're talking to me really differently. Is there something you want to talk about?
Mm.
Now it's tricky because oftentimes kids won't say daddy said or mommy said because they're protecting the other parent.
Yeah.
But I think that if you have a sense of it, then you need to speak to the other parent and say, listen, this isn't about you or me. This is about the well-being of our child who we both love.
Yeah.
And we don't want them to feel torn because what we're seeing when they come in the crossover is they're really disturbed when they come from me to you and from you to me. So we have to make sure, and I was talking to somebody about this very thing just last week. It was horrifying. It was really awful. Where a parent, was making the child feel very guilty about going back to the other one. And the child was screaming at the door, screaming, didn't want to go into the house after having self-isolated with that first parent because
Wow.
the other parent felt rejected because they were self-isolating because they were out of town anyway, it was a disaster zone, but they have to talk about it and work it through and talk about how to bring the child. It's kind of like when I was a kindergarten teacher 100 years ago.
You were a
And
kindergarten.
I
Yeah.
was a kindergarten teacher 100 years ago.
Yeah.
And and I used to tell the kids like 5-10 minutes before, we're going to have to stop playing and we're going to clean up the toys and then we're going to do something else. So I sort of gave them the heads up a few minutes before. You got to do that in parenting, when you're going to be taking the kids. You can't have like a wonderful time we're doing and everything. Okay, now you're going to your mother's.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, that's, you got to bring it down a little bit
Yeah.
and tell them we're going to be going in 10-15 minutes and boy, what fun things you're going to be doing with mom and that sort
Mhm.
of thing.
And I think
So,
you raise a really important concept in a parenting plan where you're talking about that transition and
yeah,
getting the child ready for the shift. Like and I often use in my mediation where I said, if someone knocked on the door right now and said, you have to come here now, how pleased would you be?
absolutely not. You
you know
wouldn't.
you're
Yeah,
in the middle of something, and the game or whatever the child is playing is just as important as your meeting, and so you have to think
exactly.
about how to do that shift.
Right.
Mandy's, I think, someone wants to ask a question. If you could retype it in the group, I didn't get it. The some person is asking me, but there's another question um, about apologizing to children when they might have
Yeah.
overheard things, and what do you
Yeah.
do in that situation?
About apologizing to
Yeah.
children?
Yeah.
I think it's a good thing. If you've done something that's hurtful, you were upset about something else and you displaced it onto your child, I think you need to be honest. And it's good modeling too, to say, you know what, mommy or daddy I was really upset about business and I had a bad meeting before and I should not have yelled at you because it had nothing to do with it. It wasn't your fault. And I
Right.
think that you need to do that because children internalize. And as we know, in fact, sometimes they even internalize the whole divorce thing. Are you leaving each other because of me?
Yeah.
Because this almost, I'm not saying this, you know, um, to be derogatory in any way, but some children, not some children, they go through an egocentric stage of development where things are, very much about themselves. So they think this must be about me too, you know.
Yeah.
So yeah, they think that anyways, depending on their age. Mind you, adolescents have the centration, which is a version of the egocentric development that Piaget talked about. But in any case, yeah, I think apology is really, really crucial. It doesn't weaken your stance. It really doesn't. You don't have to worry about that. I think it makes you human, and it shows them that it's important to say, I'm sorry, and they'll learn that. So we
Yeah.
can move on instead of
Yeah.
holding a grudge.
Yeah, it's good modeling behavior. I'm looking at the time. I think we
Yeah,
could probably talk all afternoon about this. I find it
probably.
fascinating. I love the in my family we have times we have defined all of these times after a particularly challenging family vacation where we realized we needed desperately to have some time. So we have Simon, you can help me. We have alone but together time, which means you
Right.
sit together on your devices together. You have
Yeah,
alone time, which is in your own space with the door closed, and then there's all the meal times, and then we had rest time and even nap time. We had all these,
perfect.
so we had
Perfect.
this whole thing. So if that helps anyone, it definitely has helped our family, and we still use it
That's
even though Simon's
amazing.
21 and our daughter is 23. So we
And it
still know,
works.
yeah, yeah.
But
But
everybody needs it. Yeah.
everyone needs it. Yeah, we all need our
Yeah.
different times for sure. Can't have all the same. But thank you so much. It's been an
Thank you
absolute
for
pleasure,
having
and
me. Yeah,
I
it's my
look forward to
pleasure. I
back.
really enjoyed it. And
Yeah, yeah,
thank
good.
you,
Thanks.
everybody, for joining in.
Yeah, thanks everyone.
Okay.
Take care. I will see you
You
again.
too. Stay
If you
safe.
want the slide, send me an email, everyone. Okay. Thanks. Okay. See ya. Bye
Okay,
bye.
take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Thanks, Linda. Bye bye.
Thank
Bye.
you, Marianne.
Thank you.